All right. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us. I'll introduce myself one more time. My name is Shannon Abbott. I am the Outreach and Engagement Manager for Common Cause Michigan. I've been with the organization since 2021, I believe. So for a couple of years, and this is my second large election cycle with the organization. There's a lot going on this year between elections, redistricting, legislation, all sorts of great things. So we're staying really busy. And we are really excited to have you here tonight. We are going to be discussing both National Popular Vote and the Michigan Voting Rights Act, the VRA, which we will get into a little bit deeper in a moment. But let me just do a quick screen share here because I want to give me just a moment. Sorry, this doesn't look super pretty and polished, but I do want to show you all what we're going to be discussing this evening. If this will actually let me click on things. Wonderful. So we've got our priorities. I want to go do a quick overview with you of what our priorities are, what the status of the legislature is, and Rep. Ryan Gans, I'm hoping you can chime in a little bit on that as well once we get over to the National Popular Vote information. When we talk about National Popular Vote, we have Rep. Ryan Gans here to give us some information about what's happening there. She is with House District 47 and is also the sponsor for the bill and I believe author as well. We also have here as some backup for any additional questions that you might have, Rebecca Warren from National Popular Vote, who's the senior advisor. We will be discussing the Michigan Voting Rights Act, the VRA, with Lotta from the Campaign Legal Center. She is senior legal counsel for voting rights with them and has been a part of the drafting conversations for the VRA. And then we are going to cap it all off with some announcements and some upcoming events and actions for everyone. Again, feel free to use the chat box. Feel free to use the Q&A box if it's showing up on your screen as well. When we get to Q&As, I will facilitate and hopefully we'll be able to get to all of your questions. So just a little bit about Common Cause. Our mission is all about being a nonpartisan grassroots organization dedicated to upholding the values of American democracy. We started back in 1970 because our founder, who was heavily embedded in politics as an advisor for multiple US presidents, said, hey, there's a lot of big money in politics and not really people representing the people themselves. They're not here and they're not being lobbied for the way businesses and corporations are. And we need that voice. Thus, Common Cause was created. We are 1.5 million members strong nationwide. We have programs in over half of the country, and we do work both on state and federal levels. We are all about open, honest, accountable government that serves everybody. We're all about promoting equal rights, opportunity, and representation for all. So that's just a super quick overview and recap for those of you who don't know us, and maybe it's your first time joining us. I do want to share just some of our top 2024 priorities. We have been focusing this year heavily on redistricting, election protection, and legislative work. In redistricting, for those of you who don't know, there was a court ruling back at the end of last year that determined that our new maps, although were great in so many ways, had some improvements that needed to be made to meet the National Voting Rights Act. And so some of the districts in Southeast Michigan are having new district lines drawn. The House maps have already been done and approved by courts, but now they're moving on to redrawing the Senate districts that were required by the court as well. So that process is just starting, and they are taking public comments and recommendations from community members in those areas in Southeast Michigan as to what you need and what you are looking for to be represented properly. With election protection is all about voting rights, making sure people are out at the polls, that they stay safe, and that they're not deterred or pushed away for any reason at all. We do voter education, youth engagement, and that's anything from, being on college campuses to make sure that students have their right to vote, heard, and know what to do. But also, we have new laws passed where we can now pre-register 16-year-olds, and so that's something we'll be working on this year. Clerk engagement, volunteer recruitment. So those observers that you see at polling locations, that they come from organizations like ours, and rapid response when things happen during election that need to be addressed. And then legislation, National Popular Vote and Michigan Voting Rights Act. Obviously, you're here to learn about those today. Those are two of our top legislative priorities. Also, the BRITE Act, which was just introduced a few weeks ago, all about transparency in our government, and looking at FOIA expansion and the ballot recount bills, amongst many others. We don't have a lot of time to take action on these things, though. So I'm going to stop screen sharing real quick because we want to share a little bit with you about where the legislature actually stands. We just had a special election in two districts, two House districts that was a week ago, week and a half ago or so. I can't keep track of time anymore. Anywho, there were two open seats and we needed to get two new representatives in those seats. So the election just happened, and it is being certified as we speak. So once those two new members are actually officially sworn into office, which should be very, very quickly here, we are going to be filled back up in the House and we can start getting legislation to start moving again. It's been held up a little bit because we had basically a 50-50 split, and a partisan level, that was making it so that legislation was not really moving the way it needed to. So now that we have both the House and the Senate fully staffed up, we are expecting for legislation to move really quickly. But it's important to know that we are in an election year, a presidential election year at that. It's a big one. So we are in a state that has a year-round legislative session. Typically, they go all year round. But this year, because of the elections, it sounds like, according to the calendars, and correct me if I'm wrong, Rep. Ryan Gans, but we will be ending session essentially at the end of June, so that elections can be the focus for everybody and possibly coming back together after the November election, which really doesn't give us a lot of time to pass what we need to pass. It only gives us a couple of months to get everything pushed through and signed in to law, unless we're waiting until 2025, and that's a pretty big risk. So that is why we're here talking about some of these issues today. These are really, really important things that we're working on and that we want to get passed, and we really can't wait until 2025 to make them happen, because we don't know what's going to happen in 2025 at this point. We can hope for the best, but we just don't know for sure. So with that being said, I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to pass it over to our guests. And thank you once again for joining us. We have Rep. Gary Reingans here from House District 47, both the author and sponsor of the National Popular Vote legislation. And I'm going to just kick it over to you.
Thank you. And how much time are you hoping that we use?
Let's try for about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll get to some Q&A if anybody.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So as far as relating to what you were saying about the schedule, I will say that we have been given our schedule through the end of June, but we have not yet been given our schedule for the rest of the year. And it's possible that we will have plenty of session days in other times outside of just after the election. So stay tuned. We are working on that right now. So that's pretty much the only correction I would have right now from what you were saying earlier. And then even in the interim, we have been able to pass a lot of bipartisan bills. In fact, one of the bills that I introduced around naloxone distribution passed today with almost 100 votes. So we have been able to do some bipartisan work in these intervening months, which is great and good news because democracy requires everybody to be participating, as you all know. So I'm excited for us to be back to full strength because I have been talking to my colleagues this week, and I will continue next week to talk about the National Popular Vote Bill. So I know that we have some folks on tonight who are probably quite familiar with National Popular Vote because this is a movement here in Michigan, but also across the whole country that's been supported by many of the groups who've been listed in the chat, like League of Women Voters. So what the heck is National Popular Vote? Well, I mean, I'm sure everybody here is familiar with the idea that in the USA, we have one person, one vote. So each of us gets, one vote a piece. And for any person that we're electing, whoever wins the most popular votes in that district will win that election. And I mean, that's what I had to do when I won my district in 2022 for the first time. So I'm in my first term. But, the one race, the one election in our country where a person can win the most popular votes but still not actually win the election is the presidency. It has happened multiple times in our country's history. My first election for president was in the year 2000. That was one of the times where Al Gore actually had more popular votes than George W. Bush. But the Electoral College is set up in a way that each state, for the most part, in the year 2000, states decided to award their Electoral College votes based on who won the popular vote just in that state. And so even though there were more overall popular votes for Al Gore, the Electoral College did end up having more Electoral College votes for George W. Bush. And that has happened again. That happened in 2016. So, I mean, this has been multiple elections in my voting life. So for me, when I was campaigning in 2022, I said, I'm running on this issue. This is important to me to make sure that the person who gets the most popular votes for president wins, right? And it's really the foundational principle of our democracy. And one of the cool things about being a state legislator is actually in our US Constitution, it says that state legislatures are the ones that have the power to decide how to award our state's electoral college votes. And in Michigan right now, we award our electoral college votes based on who has won the popular vote in our state only. And with the National Popular Vote Bill, each state who signs on to this interstate compact, much like any other interstate compact that we're part of, we as a state authorize our signing onto the compact, and there's some condition in which the compact might go into effect. So you may have heard about interstate compacts for health professionals, where one state might recognize another state's licensing, for example. This is an interstate compact where once enough states with our electoral college votes sign on to have the electoral college reach 270 votes, then this interstate compact will go into effect. And once it's in effect, then we will have the electoral college actually align with the national popular vote. So finally, we'll be able to have the electoral college align with our core democratic principle, one person, one vote. And so right now, there has been some great movement in a variety of states across the country who are signing on to this compact. When I first introduced the bill, we were under 200 electoral college votes. But since I've introduced this bill, both Minnesota and Maine, these other M states, have signed on to the interstate compact, and now we're over 200 electoral college votes committed. We're currently at 209. So we're not very far off from enacting the interstate compact to use the national popular vote to elect our president. Right now, Michigan has 15 electoral college votes, so we'll be able to add our 15 votes in with that 209 and bring us a lot closer to being a state that joins this interstate compact. So, I mean, this is a core foundational principle in our country. We want to make sure that each one of us who's in the district of the president, which is, the whole country, we want to make sure our vote counts equally with everybody else. And it's not just me who's saying this. This is a bipartisan issue. This has passed in Michigan multiple times under Republican legislatures. It's been a while since we've had a Democratic legislature, so we will see if it passes under a Democratic legislature. I'm pretty confident it will. But we've seen this pass here in Michigan and in other states with mixed legislatures. And aside from being bipartisan, this is also supported by democracy groups like yourselves, League of Women Voters, but also other groups, labor groups. This is supported by environmental groups. I think a lot of folks are recognizing the importance of really living up to our democratic ideals here in the United States and here in Michigan. So as we are back to full strength, and I'm talking to my colleagues about, please make sure you're ready to vote for this bill. We're really trying to make sure we do this before we adjourn for the summer to do some work in our districts. And it has passed committee in the House. We have the same bill introduced in the Senate. There's actually two bills. One bill is the same as every other state that has passed this. And then the other bill makes sure that once it's enacted here in Michigan, the rest of our election law really aligns with this. So we have two bills here in Michigan. The House bills have passed the House Elections Committee, and we are waiting for a full floor vote once we are back to full strength. In the Senate, we're in discussions right now about when to have hearings in the committee. And it might make sense once these bills pass the House to have the Senate hearings in committee with all of the bills, right? The two Senate bills and two House bills. The bills are exactly the same. So it would really be the same testimony. But we just introduced it in both chambers just to see where we could get movement first. So I think that's probably all of the nitty-gritty details. It is possible that Rebecca might have something else to add. It's funny, Rebecca's actually my former House member and senator, but now is also my constituent. So I told her to text me if I left anything out, and I haven't seen anything yet. So it's possible I've hit all the highlights. And I'm really grateful to be able to partner with Rebecca and the National Popular Vote group, because this is really a national movement. This isn't just a Michigan movement. This is a national movement. And there are literally millions of us who believe that each one of our votes should be equal when we're electing the president. So with that, I am happy to take any corrections or additions, Rebecca, or any questions from the audience.
I guess I would just say, you did a fantastic job, Rep. Gans. Thank you so much for being our sponsor in Michigan and for being such a great champion from the time that you were running for office through all the hard work you're doing with your colleagues. We appreciate you so much. The only thing I would add is one of the other problems that we have with the current system as it is in place now is that every cycle, a very small number of states are the ones that actually determine who is going to be the president of our country. And this gets to the heart of what you said, one person, one vote, such an important principle, and how we elect every other office in the land. But what happens right now is 8 to 10 to 12 max states are where the entirety of the presidential general election is run. And that then 38 to 40 states, all of their citizens literally just sit on the sidelines waiting for us to tell them who is going to be the president. The promise of a national popular vote is every voter will be relevant in every state, in every presidential election. And what could be more truly fundamentally American than that? So we're hoping for that outcome as well.
Thank you. And I mean, folks are probably already seeing that, right? If you listen to podcasts, if you listen to the news, they're talking about what's happening in Nevada, Arizona, North Carolina. They call it the Sun Belt states. And then there's the Blue Wall states with Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and us. And it's like, we're not the only states here, man. It's a really important point to make sure that we're engaging all of the voters across the whole country.
I appreciate that so much. And we hear all the time, like as an organizer specifically, I hear all the time from people, our system is broken. We need to get rid of the electoral college, right? Like we just need to get rid of it. And I'm like, I don't disagree with you. But ultimately it is a system that we have and a lot of people like it. So if we have it, let's make it work for the people. Let's make it work so that each of our votes actually counts equally. I was just listening to public radio the other day, and they were talking about the electoral college and what's happening with the elections, and they're like, chances are one candidate is probably going to win a significant number of votes more than the other, but still might not get elected. And it's true. It's a very real,
Oh, is
real
that legal?
possibility. Yeah, it's a very real possibility here. And Michigan is one of the larger electoral college states that may make or break that for whoever the winner might be. And so it's important for us to know that. And it's important that we say, hey, we are a swing state usually. We are considered often a purple state. I don't know if everyone's considering us that anymore or not, but we do get a lot of attention because we are a swing state. So can you maybe either of you talk about what that might look like and how other states maybe are reacting, how much attention maybe they're getting before an election happens? Because when the ballots are cast, ultimately that's going to make the decision, but there's a big difference beforehand while campaigning is happening as well, correct?
It's not just painting, I would say, too. I mean, there are studies, and Rebecca can add information here, but there are studies that have been examining the amount of federal appropriations that go to certain states, right? And we have seen that there is a disproportionate amount of federal appropriations that go to these swing states. And it just seems, right now, great, Michigan's a beneficiary of that, but that doesn't mean we always will be, and it doesn't mean we always have been. So if we're truly committed to democracy, we should really be thinking about how do we make sure that everybody's really part of the picture? How are we engaging everybody across the country, not just us? I mean, great for us now, but like it's kind of not fair. So I think we should be operating in a fair way, in my opinion. Rebecca, do you have anything to add for that?
Well, I'll back up one half step and address, Shannon, your point about we certainly hear this a lot along the path of working on national popular vote. Why don't we just get rid of the electoral college, right? People have big feelings about it. Why don't we just, as opposed to passing the national popular vote, we could just abolish the electoral college. And our organization, as National Popular Vote, to whom I'm senior advisor, we don't take an opinion. We don't make an opinion on that. But we know what's involved in that, right? Is passage by Congress and ratification by 35 states. That at best could happen with a 10 to 20 year horizon, at best, right? If that could happen in our lifetime. The national popular vote is something that, as Rep. Rankin said, has already passed in 18 jurisdictions. 209 of the 270 electoral votes we need. We only have 61 electoral votes to need to implement the compact. This could actually be the law of the land for the presidential election in 2028, which is amazing to consider. And I would say that the most key point that Rep. Rankin's made about being a swing state, being a battleground state really is a fleeting status. Like Michigan has certainly had that opportunity to be one. And I tell a story about my own existence as an elected official. And Rep. Rankin said I, was a predecessor of hers, served in Michigan in the legislature in both the House and the Senate. When I was running for my first reelect in the House, 2008, Barack Obama was running for president for the first time. Michigan was a battleground state, and there were so many federal dollars flowing into our state. We had every yard sign, tchotchkes. We had door hangers that had Obama's picture and mine. It was the most wonderful thing. And just 4 years later, in 2012, with the reelect, Michigan was not considered a swing state. And we literally got zero attention. We were digging in our garages for rusty wired yard signs to put out in our yard. So battleground status is fleeting. And at a core principle level, one person, one vote, every voter relevant in every state means everybody will get attention. It will matter what votes they get in every state, not just red states, not just blue states, not just big states, not just small states. Literally, every voter in every state.
Mhm. And I mean, it's important to think. I mean, there's literally millions of Democrats in Texas that get disregarded. There's literally millions of Republicans in California that get disregarded. And that's not fair to those voters. They need to have a vote and a voice too.
Absolutely. I do see if anybody else has any questions, we have a few more minutes with these two, but I do see one question here. And that is, let's see here. Give me just a second. So what happens if we pass national popular vote in Michigan and then we get enough other states to where we actually have it implemented nationally, right? Because it's not going to get implemented until we have the 270 state electoral college states worth of signers on this, right? Or participants. What happens if we're like, hey, this just isn't working? We don't think this is working. We don't want it anymore.
Is a mechanism for us to be able to repeal the law. There are prohibitions, we can't repeal it within 6 months of the election, or 6 months of the swearing in of the president. So there are ways for us to repeal it if that should happen. But I think once we get in the compact and people see that it really encourages voter participation, it's hard for me to imagine that people would want to back out.
Absolutely.
I'm going to say yes, and yes, absolutely. Everything Rep. Rangans just said, but also, and another question that we get often on the heels of that question is, what if we're at 270 and we have a presidential election, and then immediately after someone withdraws on the outside of that blackout period that Rep. Rangans referred to, and we fall below 270, then what will happen? Will that be chaos that we're having some national popular vote elections and some not national popular vote elections? And I can guarantee you, as part of National Popular Vote's national team that works on this issue in many states, we're not going to stop when we get to 270. We're going to keep working. We're going to keep adding additional states. And just like Rep. Rangan said, we completely believe that when individual voters in all states around the country see how impactful it is that their vote is not disregarded, all those Republicans in California, all those Democrats in Texas, we believe that we will continue to add states as we go.
Awesome. I have one more question here, and then I'll let you two go. I know that you are in your car and you're often at an event, both of you. So thank you again for being here in the middle of both of those things. But the last question that I have for you is around the legality, because this is something that I hear, and it's a question that I see in the chat as well. But how is this even legal? This can't be legal, right? Like, that's against the Constitution. And I would love to hear from you both about that, because I personally know that's not true. It is legal, but if you can tell us a little bit about what that looks like.
Sure. So I can start, and then Rebecca can add a lot more detail, I would say. But in the U.S. Constitution, the Constitution gives us the power as state legislators to award our electoral college votes how we decide in our own state. And so, for us to decide to join this interstate compact, that is completely within what the U.S. Constitution is authorizing us to do.
Love that. Do you have anything
Absolutely. Article 2, Section 1 of the U.S. Constitution. Rep. Rangan said it in her intro. She's been completely on message and 100% right. Individual state legislatures, the power to award electors to the Electoral College is vested in state legislatures. This is absolutely a power they have. Many states over the history chosen different paths to awarding their electors, so that's absolutely the case. Then I get the question, sometimes the follow-up, which is, but what about where we are today? What about the Supreme Court we have today, right? Which I would say, looking, many of you know my history, not just in electoral, in election reform, but in women's rights and women's reproductive health. We have a Supreme Court right now where literally the majority of the court was nominated by non-national popular vote winners. That has an important impact on our country. But even given that, I will still say, as recently as just 2 years ago, there was an unrelated but unspecific but tangential case before this U.S. Supreme Court with these justices
Oh no, you're breaking up.
Ah. She's going for it still, though.
Court said, reaffirmed Article 2, Section 1. They reaffirmed that state legislatures have the right to make these decisions. So I feel confident that not only is it constitutional, even this current SCOTUS will uphold this principle, as they have, as recently as 2 years ago.
I love hearing that. That's great context. I appreciate it. And again, thank you, ladies, both for being here this evening and joining us. I know that you both have things that you have to get off to, and we have a whole nother topic that we want to discuss tonight, which is the Michigan Voting Rights Act. If you'd like to stay on, feel free to, but also feel free to hop off if you need to. So with that being said, I am going to introduce you here to Lotta Knott with the Campaign Legal Center, and have her kind of just take over and talk about the Michigan Voting Rights Act, because this is really, really exciting legislation that has been in the works for quite some time and is still going through some edits here and there. But we cannot wait for this to get passed in Michigan so that we can codify our rights here. Take it on, Lotta, go ahead.
Thanks, Shannon. Yeah, as Shannon said, my name's Lotta Knott, and I work at the Campaign Legal Center. If you don't know our organization, we're a national, nonpartisan organization. Our mission is advancing democracy through litigation, policy work, research, and providing support in all of those areas to our state partners. The issues that we work on are campaign finance, redistricting, voting rights, and ethics. And state voting rights are a big policy focus for us. CLC successfully settled the first case that was brought under the Washington Voting Rights Act. We helped to draft the Connecticut Voting Rights Act, which passed last year. Currently, we're working on VRAs in Minnesota, New Jersey, Colorado, Maryland, and Michigan. This is not work that we do single-handedly. In all of these places, we work very closely with state-based organizations and with national organizations like NAACP's Legal Defense Fund and the Harvard Election Law Clinic, and the Brennan Center. These are always efforts that involve a lot of organizations. And the idea of a Michigan VRA emerged last year when when Secretary Benson's office expressed that this was a priority for them. Very exciting for us that the Secretary of State would be like, this is something I want to get behind. They reached out to us for our input. Not just us, they also reached out to LDF to promote the Vote Michigan, ACLU Michigan. And our organizations kind of just came together to work on a draft of this bill, which was introduced during last year's legislative session and again during this year's session, sponsored by Senator Camilleri, Senator Moss, Senator Chang. I am probably forgetting senators, but sponsored by some very good people who believe in this bill. So that's why I'm here talking to you guys on this Wednesday evening, but let me back up a bit and get into what a state VRA actually is and why Michigan would want one in the first place. So let's go back to the late 1860s. Like let's back up a lot. This is, no, I'm serious, we're doing this. This is the period after the Civil War that I'm talking about, when the Constitution is amended in a pretty crucial way. 13th Amendment prohibits slavery, and then the 14th Amendment guarantees equal protection under the law. And the 15th Amendment says that federal and state governments, they can't deny citizens the right to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. All great amendments. These are all great. But for many, many years, there's no enforcement mechanism for that 15th Amendment. So over the course of the next few decades, you get a lot of states that just start engaging in practices that do deny citizens the right to vote on the basis of race. They institute poll taxes, property ownership requirements to vote, literacy tests, all of these things with exceptions for people whose grandfathers could vote, which of course excludes anyone whose grandfather was a slave. They draw district boundaries to make sure that voters of color can't elect candidates of their choice. And these are all laws and policies that are colorblind on their face, but they're designed to exclude Black citizens disproportionately. And the 15th Amendment on its own doesn't contain any guidance on what the federal government can do to make sure that states aren't denying people the right to vote. It doesn't have any guidance on what a person who's been denied the right to vote can do. And it doesn't say what it means to have your right to vote denied or abridged. So moving forward from the 1860s, the Federal Voting Rights Act is passed in 1965, and it does all of those things. It allows the newly created federal Department of Justice and impacted voters to challenge racially discriminatory laws and maps and election systems in court. And not just laws and maps that they can prove are intentionally discriminatory, which is a pretty hard thing to prove. Also laws and maps that just have discriminatory results, because I mean, ultimately, I think that it's a huge deal that the Federal Voting Rights Act, like, there's this understanding that it doesn't really matter why this was put in place. The fact of the matter is the results are discriminatory. It also prohibits voter intimidation. It protects members of language minority groups and requires that language minority communities of a certain size be provided with translated ballots and voting materials. And before 2013, it required that certain states and jurisdictions with a history of racial discrimination, it requires those guys to pre-clear any changes to election laws and maps with the DOJ or a federal court. So essentially, like that's a way of nipping a lot of racially discriminatory laws in the bud before they can even go into effect. So I say that was prior to 2013 because in 2013, the Supreme Court invalidated the pre-clearance provision of the Federal Voting Rights Act, which sucked. But this is not the only instance of a court ruling diminishing the power of the federal VRA. Since 1965, there have been a lot of lawsuits under the federal VRA and a lot of court decisions, and a body of law has emerged on how to decide these cases. And not all of it is great for voters of color. The Supreme Court has set precedent that makes it extremely challenging for plaintiffs to prevail in these cases. As an initial matter, voters of color who are challenging a redistricting map for diluting their voting power, they have to prove that they're a residentially segregated community, and they have to prove that white voters vote as a block to prevent their preferred candidates from being elected. And that's before the actual trial. That's just a precursor for them to get to trial, where they will still have to prove that these maps or these systems violate the Federal Voting Rights Act. It's a lot. And even if voters of color can overcome these hurdles and win their lawsuits, precedent means that courts defer to the solutions proposed by the local government. So to be clear, the precedent under the federal VRA is for courts to ask the losing party in the lawsuit to suggest the remedy and to give that deference to the losing party, the government that implemented the discriminatory voting system or law in the first place. They get to decide how to remedy the problem. And just last year, the Eighth Circuit issued a very controversial opinion saying that only the DOJ has the right to bring lawsuits under the federal VRA and not like actually impacted voters, which is awful given that the vast majority of federal VRA lawsuits are brought by impacted voters. And the Eighth Circuit's decision doesn't affect Michigan. It affects your neighbors in Minnesota and Iowa and Arkansas, but it kind of shows that these key components of the federal VRA, they can't really be taken for granted anymore. A state VRA is a way to shore up the protections of the Federal Voting Rights Act and to improve on them. And the Michigan VRA, well, it prohibits local governments in Michigan from implementing voting laws and policies and practices that deny members of a protected class, that's a race or language minority group, equal access to voting opportunities. And it also prevents them from implementing district maps or election systems that dilute their voting power. And that, what I just said, that's part of the federal VRA. But enshrining that in state law means that Michigan will always have it, regardless of what the Supreme Court might do with the federal VRA. But the Michigan VRA goes beyond that. It also improves on the federal VRA in a lot of different ways. It makes it easier for communities of color to prove that a map or a voting system discriminates against them in a lot of ways. And for one thing, a community under the Michigan Voting Rights Act, the community doesn't have to prove that it's residentially segregated. You don't have to be a compact residentially segregated community for a system to discriminate against you. The Michigan VRA recognizes that. It also empowers state courts who are hearing these cases to consider a wide range of remedies suggested by every party and choose the one that's best suited to help the community, as opposed to just going with what the local government would prefer. It encourages, it's not all bad for local governments. It actually encourages voters and local governments to work together to remedy potential violations before litigation. Litigation is long and expensive. Kind of everyone would rather avoid it. So before you can file a lawsuit, if you're a prospective plaintiff, you have to give your local officials notice that your voting rights have been violated and give them time to proactively fix things. 60 days. Not a crazy amount of time, but it definitely, like, if your government is acting in good faith, it can help them avoid litigation, and it can help like a solution be implemented in a much quicker time frame. And this bill will also avoid litigation, but because it institutes a form of preclearance. Not exactly what was under the federal VRA, but basically if a local government in Michigan has a history of voting rights violations from within the last 10 years, then they'll have to pre-clear any changes they want to make to their election laws and procedures with a court. That's all in SB 401 is the name of the bill. There are 3 other bills in the Michigan Voting Rights Act package. They all do good things. SB 402 sets up a statewide election database and information office. And the point of that is that it would centrally house and maintain all the data from all of the local governments that's needed to monitor their compliance with this and to promote best practices. SB 403 is about language assistance in elections. Again, it's an improvement on federal law. Federal law requires that a county or a city provide translated voting materials if there's a community of more than 5% or more than 10,000 voting age citizens that speak the same non-English language and have limited proficiency in English and have a lower literacy rate than the national literacy rate. It's kind of a high bar. The Michigan Voting Rights Act would expand on what the government offers in terms of language assistance by making that a community of at least 2.5% or 600 people has the right to these translated materials. Because really, like limited proficiency in English shouldn't be a barrier to actually being able to understand like ballots. Ballots are hard to understand even for people who speak proficient English. So this just really ensures that more people who need this will have access to these materials. And SB 404 requires local governments to provide the option of curbside voting for voters who can't enter polling sites. All good things. And we are seeing some movement this year with the Michigan Voting Rights Act. I mentioned it was introduced last year, but didn't get a hearing. But this year, hearings have been, I think, tentatively scheduled in the Senate for May 1st and May 8th. May 1st is for SB 401. That's the one that establishes that like the right of Michiganders to challenge like voting laws and systems that dilute their vote or prevent their access to the ballot. And then on May 8th, I believe there's going to be hearings on the other ones I mentioned about the statewide database, language assistance, and curbside voting for disabled voters. So it's really been an effort of so many different organizations to push these forward, and so many legislators who just, and of course the Secretary's office, all who have like a huge interest in getting this passed. And I think that concludes my spiel on like what the Michigan Voting Rights Act is about and why I think it's worth supporting and why it's important for Michigan, but I'd be happy to take any questions.
That was fantastic. And I want to recognize that this is a big topic, and that is a lot of information, and it's great information. And it's so important because on a federal level, we don't know what's going to happen, right? Voting rights have been under attack left and right, in other states as well as nationally. And so having Michigan, who's already, like, as a state, we've already been doing an amazing job of passing really wonderful voting laws, and we had a couple of amazing and transformative ballot initiatives that passed, that the people in general like overwhelmingly passed. They were like, we care about these, we want fair representation, we want early voting, we want all of these different things that are going to make voting more accessible to the people and our democracy stronger as a whole. So everybody, please feel free to pop any questions that you have in the chat box or in the Q&A box, and we will do what we can to get to as many as we can. I do want to let everybody know this is not a one and done conversation about the Michigan VRA. This is a really big topic. We do have some tentatively scheduled upcoming events with the Department of State for them to share some more updates and context as we move forward with all of this, as well as some of the sponsors of the legislation. So keep your eyes out for all of that. I do see one question here, and that is regarding curbside. Don't we already have curbside voting here in Michigan? Why is that important to have that in this legislation?
Well, you do already have curbside voting. There are certain protections that and details that go into the SB 404, the curbside voting bill. I think like just to establish like when the obligation kicks in for a local government to provide the service. So some of it is just in the details, honestly.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and a lot of people don't even know right now that curbside is available to many individuals. So if you didn't know, now you know it exists.
And one part of that is actually requiring signs.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, absolutely. And I will say with that, it has been a little bit of a contentious topic because it does put a burden on the poll workers and the clerk's offices to make sure that that happens. You have to make sure that you have enough people actually working the polls to make sure that that happens and that it's done in a safe and secure way. But it has allowed a lot of individuals, an opportunity that they wouldn't have otherwise had to be able to vote in a way that feels safest and best for them. Um, let's see, do we have any other questions in the chat here? I'll give you all just a quick moment. Now, language is something that is something that I personally am really interested in, and fascinated about. I only speak English. I speak very little French, from whatever I can remember from middle school and high school, but we do have a significant population across the state and in some concentrated populations across the state that speak different languages. But when we're talking about proficiency, it's not just languages, it's also people who speak English that have that are not as they don't have the same understanding when they're reading things as maybe when they're listening to things or whatever might be the case. Um, but something that has come up quite often is, clerks, just this is more for context, this is not a question for you. But clerks offices, when they do have things translated, they are required to, number one, they pay for it, right? And they have to find their own people, and that can be a really big burden on them as well. And if you have one person translating in one community, let's say to Spanish, and then in a completely different community, a different clerk's office, they hire somebody different, things might potentially get translated slightly differently, because it is based a little bit in interpretation. And so this is something that I find really fascinating about this legislation and how it could possibly address that. Can you maybe speak just a tiny bit to what that looks like?
Oh yeah, no, that's an incredibly good point. And one thing is that this actually puts the onus on the secretary's office to provide the translated materials, which is very helpful because, as you said, like you could have different people in different counties translating things differently. This actually is like, well, you know what? We're gonna like have a standardized, like the secretary will announce the jurisdictions that need to provide translated materials, and then the materials, it's up to the local governments to provide them. But like the Secretary of State's office is also going to like basically do a lot of the lifting as well. Because the idea isn't to penalize like local governments and say, okay, you're gonna have to translate all of your ballots into 50 different languages. I'd also say that with the requirement for when you have to provide language assistance, it kicks in if a community, I said it was like 2.5% of the population, but if the community is less than 100, it doesn't kick in because, there can be some very small communities out there. And while it'd be nice to be able to provide everybody with translated ballots, there's this understanding that sometimes clerks have limits. So I think a lot of the provisions try to walk that line.
Yeah, a family of 3 will kick you over that percentage, right? Um, perfect. Thank you for that. I see a question here again about curbside voting. You addressed, well, I guess it's not specifically about curbside voting. You addressed curbside voting, but is there anything else in here for folks with disabilities right now?
funny. I'm looking at like the latest version of SB 404. It does allow for just, it makes sure that providing like resources like food, entertainment, warmth, necessities to people who are in line to vote, that's basically like, that's codified. That's something that like that can't be taken away in Michigan law. That's kind of a reaction to that terrible law that passed in Georgia that said you can't give water to people in line. Not specifically for disabled voters, but like, you know, that's something that's beneficial for all voters. And then like, sorry, I'm actually looking at the bill right now. Like, what else does it do? I'm so sorry.
They're
It-
constantly making updates to this bill right now. There are constant conversations happening with clerks' offices, with stakeholders, with legislators, with organizations across the board to try to address these things, which is why I'm sure you have to look back because there are changes.
And I will say that the version that was introduced last year had a few different provisions. It would have allowed for monitors for polling locations to making sure they were complying with the Americans with Disabilities Act and with like Michigan law that serves disabled voters. That's some of that isn't in the current version of the bill because of honestly, like with negotiations and with certain things that like clerks thought would be too onerous. So yeah, I think that I think that's something that the bill isn't necessarily like, it doesn't provide all the protections. I think it's we as like advocates are always dreaming big, but we'll see what the final version turns out to be.
We can always pass more legislation, right?
Mhm.
I do want to note real quick that I don't have it in front of me, so I can't think of the exact title of it. If anybody knows it, feel free to pop it in the chat box here and I'll find it and I'll send it out in the follow-up email to everybody. But there is a nonprofit organization that does disability work in Michigan, and they've pulled studies together specifically about what it looks like in Michigan and where our gaps are. And I think it's really fascinating to read if it's something that you're interested in learning more about, not only what the gaps are, but it also discusses a little bit of like what protections we do have, but that we need to make sure that we are communicating properly. And that's something that organizations like ours and our partners do, is communicating with not only clerks' offices, with poll workers, with just community members as a whole, volunteers who are out kind of monitoring what's happening during the election. We want to make sure that everybody knows that these certain things, like curbside voting as an example, is available to people who need it, because that education isn't always there and not everybody always has the proper information or training on what those processes look like. And I say that because it ties into the last question that we have time for, and feel free if you want to pop in some more questions, I might be able to stay over a few more minutes, but is what does the oversight look like on curbside voting? And I'm not sure if there's anything in the legislation specifically about the process and oversight, but I know right now that is a conversation that we have oftentimes in our meetings as coalition members and with the Department of State, because the oversight is kind of left up to the clerks, right? Is how do they run their program? How are they staffed? But you have to make sure obviously you're in a secure sleeve when you're passing it along and things like that, because it has, if you're at a polling location, you have to make sure that it gets put in the tabulator and things like that. So do you have any additional insight onto what that oversight might look like in
Well,
curbside voting, either now or kind of the potential proposal?
there's certain provisions in the bill right now that say that like, two election inspectors from different political parties, they have to deliver the ballot inside a secrecy sleeve, and they and like when it comes to like putting it in the tabulator, there's certain like regulations about like, or not regulations, sorry, there's certain provisions in the law about like how the process will be done to ensure security and to ensure that the ballot's fed into a tabulator, and that I hate the word shenanigans, but that shenanigans don't happen, I suppose.
My nickname, Shannon. I love that. Thank you. And again, this is not a one and done conversation. This is continuing. We have, as you heard, we have a couple of committee hearings coming up. I actually didn't know about May 1st, so thank you for that. I'm gonna mark that on my calendar. I do want to show everybody real quick a few things that I have prepared here. I'm gonna do a quick screen share. And this is all about some of our upcoming actions. And I'm not going to zoom this out because I do want to show you a couple tabs on my screen here. But the first thing that we have, action steps around the Michigan Voting Rights Act. So one, I'm about to pop in the chat box a link to a petition. We'd love for you to sign it. This is a pretty simple petition. It's saying, hey, we believe that we deserve a Voting Rights Act. We believe that we can pass this, and we need you to make it a priority. And this will go to the legislators. We also would love for folks to submit their own comment cards. We will, I'm sure, probably be doing it as an organization ourselves, but individual comments also help. And I will send you information on how to do that in a follow-up email. You can also email or call, leave messages for your legislators directly to let them know that this is important to you, as well as the chamber leaders. A lot of people don't realize that, you know, if you have the House floor leader or the person who's leading the elections committee or whatever it might be, they're representing you too, even if it's not your direct legislator. So you can tell them that you want them to make these a priority as well. And tell everybody that you know. People should know that this is happening. People should know that it's coming up. The bill numbers again are 401, 402, 403, and 404 on the Senate side. And then I want to give you just a short recap with national popular vote. We have House Bills 4156 and 4440 are the ones that we're looking at moving right now. If you're curious, the matching bill numbers in the Senate, which are probably just going to sit there and not move at all because the House bills are moving forward, Senate Bill 126 and Senate Bill 295. We are so close to being at this 270 electoral votes. We are very, very close to that. And very similarly to the VRA, the actions that you can take. We have a petition. We also are going to have a phone bank coming up here on May 9th for folks to join. There are 2 time slots that you can sign up for from noon to 2 and 4 to 6. And then again, contacting your legislators, the floor leaders, and letting everybody you know that these are happening. These are what our petitions look like: National Popular Vote and the Michigan Voting Rights Act. We have our phone bank. We host phone banks weekly. They're typically on Thursdays from the same times, noon to 2 and 4 to 6, but they're on different topics all the time. So you can see you can sign up for a ton of them here. But if you're interested in National Popular Vote specifically, we want you to sign up for May 9th. Those are both listed there. And we have a couple other things coming up. One of them is this evening, actually at 8 o'clock. Common Cause is hosting a webinar about lowering the voting age in Michigan to 6, or lowering the voting age everywhere to 16. In Michigan, we just passed pre-registration for 16-year-olds last year. So if you know any 16 or 17-year-olds, they can pre-register to vote now, even though they won't be able to actually vote till they're 18. But why not lower the voting age as a whole so 16-year-olds can vote, because they are so impacted and they are more engaged than ever. And let's see, a couple other things I'll show you here real quick. We have next Wednesday, part 2 of our legislative priorities series is going to be on the BRITE Act, which is a transparency bill package that is so important for us to pass. Michigan is one of the least transparent states in the nation, and we need to change that. We need to know that we can trust the people who are elected to lead us, and that comes with transparency and disclosures. So we'll be discussing that. There are local elections for some of you on May 7th. Head over to mi.gov/vote to see if you have an election coming up and details about what that looks like, where your polling location and all of that is. Redistricting is happening now for the Senate map. So if you are in Southeast Michigan, please watch for updates and get comments in. And then election volunteering, if you are interested in that, head over to protectthevote.net, fill out your information to let us know you're interested, and we will be in contact with you. So this is a lot of information. I'm going to pop some of those links into the chat box here for you real quick. And I want to give everybody just a really sincere thank you for joining us this evening, being a part of the conversation and engaging. Thank you to our guests for joining us. And I will also put my email address in the chat box in case you want to reach out to me directly and ask any questions or follow up in any other way. Give you all just a couple of minutes to grab those links. And thank you for being here. I know we have people from various organizations that have joined us this evening, and we don't do this work alone. It is so important to know that we don't do it alone as organizations. We work in a large group of coalition members and organizations that do this work together. And we do this work directly with you. We cannot do what we do without you taking action as well. You cannot see the links. Hold on just a second. Let me pop them back in here. Oh, it's because I didn't send it to everybody. That's why. There you go. Hopefully you can see that now. And my email address. Thank you. Great questions, everybody. And take care. Keep your eyes out for follow-up email in the next day or so. You'll receive it no later than Friday. You might get it tomorrow. There will be a recording as well as all of these actions available to you for easy access.